Okay, so we're moving on to reproduction. And after last week, this will, I think, be a little easier for you to adopt and digest. There is a certain amount of physiology, of course, as with any new system, there's lots of structures and functions of those structures, a certain amount of histology, of course, but it's not, as much as the urinary system for sure. So this is a good one to be able to jump into and just do a lot of structure function, type activities. There is a certain amount of physiology, that we need to look at as far as, of course, their functions, but a couple hormones, and then, how comparing and contrasting the target sites of some of these hormones in males and females. And then we look a little bit at formation of these cells, spermiogenesis and oogenesis, or spermatogenesis. All right, so we're going to begin with looking at, we generally start with males and look at all the structures and functions, then we move on to females. So you need to be able to identify all the structures: scrotum, testes, epididymis, bulbourethral gland or Cowper's gland, seminal vesicles, the penis, and within that, the urethra, the corpora cavernosa, and the corpus spongiosum. Then we have the prostate gland, the ejaculatory duct, and the ductus deferens or the vas deferens. And as usual, it's easiest to start at one point and work your way through in a kind of particular forward pathway. And that's what we'll be doing in the males and the females. We start with either the testes in the male and follow the pathway that those cells, the sperm would follow. And then in females, we begin in the ovaries where these oocytes are generated and follow their pathway. Okay, so we have functions, and the physiological functions that go with the structures. So as usual, I'm going to start down on the bottom, and we're going to match up the function with the term because that seems to be easiest. All right, A, copulatory organ, that is the penis. B, stores and matures sperm. That would be your epididymis. Then we have C, secretes acidic fluid that activates the sperm. That would be the prostate gland. D, transports sperm to the ejaculatory duct. That would be the vas deferens. E, sperm production site in testes. That is actually within the seminiferous tubules. The seminiferous tubules are in the testes, but the specific area. Let's see, F, secretes alkaline fluid to neutralize acidity of the urethra and the vagina. Also mucus for lubrication. That would be the bulbourethral gland. G, produces sperm and androgens like testosterone. That's the testes themselves. H, protective layer that helps regulate temperature of the testes. That would be the scrotum. I, transports both sperm and urine. That would be the urethra. J, secretes fructose or nutrients for sperm, also alkaline fluid. That would be the seminal vesicle. Excuse me. K, stores sperm until ejaculation. That would be the ejaculatory duct. L, tissue that expands to form erections or maintains a patent urethra. That is the function of the corpora cavernosa / corpus spongiosum. And then M, testosterone production in the testes. Right, those are the interstitial cells. All right, then when it comes to females, we need to identify the mons pubis, labia majora, labia minor, clitoris, the uterus, including the areas of the cervix and the layers of the endometrium, myometrium, perimetrium. On the breasts, we have the mammary ducts and the mammary glands, the vagina, the ovaries, and the fallopian tubes, and then the fimbriae. Okay, so let's go down and start matching up our functions. A transports milk to the surface. Those are the mammary ducts. And B produces milk, the mammary gland. C produces oocytes, estrogen, and progesterone. Those are the ovaries. D, the organ where implantation and fetal development occurs. That is the uterus. E, site of fertilization and transports embryo or early embryo to the uterus. Those are the fallopian tubes. F, thick inner lining where blastocyst, the early embryo, implants, but also the layer that sheds during menstruation. That is the endometrium. G, the outer layer that anchors the uterus in place. That would be the perimetrium. And H, the smooth muscle layer that contracts to expel the fetus. That's the myometrium. That will be the target of oxytocin. I, passageway for childbirth and copulation organ. That is the vagina. Moves oocyte to the uterine tube or acts to capture it upon ovulation into the uterine tube. That would be the fimbriae. Okay, then we have, cushions the pubic symphysis. That's your mons pubis up at the top. L, outer fatty folds and inner folds that protect the vagina and the urethra. That's again up on top, the labia major / minor. N, the erectile tissue is the clitoris. And N, the uterine outlet to the vagina, that's the cervix. Okay, so then you exercise 3 is spermatogenesis and oogenesis. It says distinguish between meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, diploid and haploid cells. So there's a big cookie sheet type model that goes with this, where you have spermatogenesis on the left-hand side and oogenesis on the right-hand side. And it begins with your stem cells. And then you begin, where mitosis is occurring all the time. And then in females, one cell is going to be designated to mature and go from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. And then it halts at different intervals in females. It remains as a secondary oocyte until it's ovulated and then fertilized, and it completes meiosis 2 to produce your secondary oocyte in its final form. And then upon fertilization, you now have a zygote. So females is a little more complicated. And we'll look at that a little bit more in the next lab as well when we look at development. Spermatogenesis is pretty straightforward. You have these spermatogonia, or these stem cells that replicate over and over again mitotically, just like any other cell. But then they will be designated to begin to mature and become a primary spermatocyte as it enters meiosis 1 and completes meiosis 1. You end with a secondary spermatocyte. That then becomes the beginning point for meiosis 2. And at the end of meiosis 2, these cells divide again to produce 4 viable sperm. Exercise 4 is histology. So we look at the testes. You're to identify that you are looking at the testes. You should be able to identify the seminiferous tubules, interstitial cells, a spermatid, a spermatocyte, and a spermatogonia. I'll help you differentiate those because it's really location, location, location. the cells that are to the outer periphery of these seminiferous tubules that look like little tubes on end repeating all over. Those are the spermatogonia. And then as they mature and they migrate toward the lumen, the interior of that tubule, they become the spermatocytes, as a primary and secondary. You don't have to distinguish between them, just know that they're spermatocytes. And then once they their nuclei assume this oval shape, they're spermatids. And then you can see them, they develop a tail, which make them a spermatozoa. And sometimes you can see them in the lumen of the tube there. And from there, those spermatozoa will travel up to the epididymis, where they will stay and continue to become more modified and mature to take, what we consider a mature form of the sperm, with the head, an acrosome, a mid region, and then the tail. The ovaries, we'll look at those, identify structures on the slides and a meiosis board. So those are the larger kind of like cookie sheet models. And there is one big ovary. It's about 16 inches by 18 inches, a model of a great big ovary, and shows the different phases that the ovary goes through. So you're to identify a primary follicle with its primary oocyte, a secondary follicle with a secondary oocyte, follicular or granulosa cells that are found in those follicles as well. What we call a ruptured follicle. Upon ovulation, we have this follicle that's rupturing. It's a nice mature one where you can see the oocyte being liberated. The material that remains behind from that follicle is called the corpus luteum, which is another term for that is the yellow body. So it's always indicated in yellow. And then as that degenerates, it becomes a corpus albicans. So those rupturing follicles and the corpus albicans are only found on the models. They're not found on the slides. And let me just come back and help you define something. When we say a primary follicle or a secondary follicle, it's two structures together. It's very similar to in the nephrons, where we looked at the glomerular capillaries. Hello, the glomerular capillaries and the Bowman's capsule surrounding it, as two structures that form one unit. Well, that's what a follicle is. It includes an oocyte in the center and cells surrounding it. Those are the follicular or granulosa cells. And when they're very small, like a primordial follicle to a primary follicle, they're very small. You have an oocyte with maybe a single layer of follicular cells surrounding it. But as it completes meiosis 1 and enters meiosis 2, that not only develops more layers of follicular cells surrounding it, but the oocyte also gets larger and larger still. So it becomes fairly easy to recognize. Okay, and then we have hormonal regulation of reproduction. The diagram below lists the production sites and target sites for the hormones that regulate reproduction of both males and females. Be able to identify these sites on models and slides. Fill in the correct hormone next to the correct arrow. So we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. So I believe there might be one that's already filled out on the course page, but I have to go, we'll cover that when we go back through all the images. But this is fairly easy to label. And even if you can, again, you put like a little square or oval here, and then you write in the hormone name. But here we have the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. And I will just tell you that off to the left is going to be follicle stimulating hormone for males and females. And then over to the right of anterior pituitary is going to be luteinizing hormone for males and females. All right. So first we have to go from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. That would be GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, off to the left for both the males and females, FSH for follicle stimulating hormone. That targets the oocytes, in the females and the developing sperm in the males. So follicle stimulating hormone will target the primary secondary follicles in the female, and the spermatogenesis spermatocytes in the male. So think of it as targeting those cells, the actual cells that are carrying your DNA, the chromosomes, to mature. To the right-hand side of the anterior pituitary is luteinizing hormone, or LH. So luteinizing hormone in males targets the testes and the interstitial cells of the testes. Those are going to be the clusters of cells found between those repeating units of seminiferous tubules. And they're in clumps, and sort of like, I shouldn't say sort of like, but similar to when we looked at the thyroid gland. Remember, we had follicular cells and then parafollicular cells that were clusters of cells found between those repeating follicles. Again, another type of a follicle. Well, that's how the testes are organized as well. So those clusters of cells are interstitial cells. Luteinizing hormone targets them. They secrete now an arrow back to the left-hand side toward the testes. And not only the testes, we'll talk about that also, would be testosterone. And so testosterone does, to a certain extent, target its neighbor cells to mature. But remember, testosterone also targets other, massive amounts of tissues, to bone tissue, muscle tissue, fat tissue, brain cells. Okay, so back to the anterior pituitary to the right-hand side, luteinizing hormone in females targets the ovary and the follicular cells there. So those cells that are surrounding the oocyte within that follicle, right? And then those cells, that portion of it that remains behind is the corpus luteum after ovulation, right? So that is luteinizing hormone, right? Targets the follicular cells in the follicle. They produce estrogen and progesterone. Traveling to the breast tissue, adipose tissue, is just estrogen. So on that short little arrow, that's estrogen. But E and P, estrogen and progesterone, target the endometrium. They affect it in different ways. And we'll look at that more, next week. And I believe that's the last page. It is. So I'm going to go back up to the top. I'm going to change my share. And I'm going to go to the images. All right, so let's go up to the top. Number 10. All right, starting with the males. We have arrows 1, 2, 3, 4. The whole scrotum, kind of, which is one is pointing to number 16. 2 are the testes, 3 in this whole region, especially to right above where the 3 is. And you see all those blood vessels there? That is the epididymis. And then we have number 3 black, on that too. But 4 is pointing to the model number 3, I guess. Those are the vas deferens. So again, you should be able to associate functions with these. These are the same structures: scrotum, testes, epididymis, and vas deferens. It's just a different model. That first one was like one of the big plastic cookie sheet models. This is a more structural, I guess you'd say, relief, because it has height to it, model in lab. And so you should know their functions: the scrotum, testes, epididymis, vas deferens, or ductus deferens. All right, then we follow that tube system. We started in the kind of lower left-hand side. And look, we can follow the vas deferens anterior to the pubic symphysis, which is number 4. It passes around it, superior to the bladder, posterior toward the rectum, where it then merges with 1, the seminal vesicle. And when those tube systems merge, they form what number 2 arrow is pointing to, or on the model, it's a little black number 6. That's your ejaculatory duct. And that merges with this gland number 7. It kind of looks like a red apple. That is the prostate gland, or the number 2, the arrow number 2, or black number 6. The ejaculatory duct merges with the urethra, which is passing from the bladder superior to that through the prostate gland. And it merges with urethra there, mid-prostate. Then it continues as the urethra. And just inferior to the prostate gland is arrow number 4, pointing to the bulbourethral glands or Cowper's glands, which is the little model number 8 to the right-hand side of it. It's just a little thing. All right, this is the other model pointing to the same. You just have to turn it right side up. Sorry about that. All right, so seminal vesicles, ejaculatory duct, prostate gland, Cowper's gland. Function, function, function. Then we enter into the penis. So we follow that. The whole organ is the penis. 1 is the urethra. 3 is not only the blue tissue at the end there, where it has a little white number 13 for it, but it's that blue tissue that is to each side of the urethra. And then we have the 2 parallel columns of erectile tissue too. So that is the urethra, the corpus spongiosum, and the corpus cavernosum. The spongiosum is 3, that surrounds the penis. Right here, we're pointing to the urethra at number 1. Here, 3 is giving you a better idea that and this is a different color, at least it's not all blue. That is the corpus spongiosum, and 2 is the corpus cavernosum. Okay. All right, now we're at the female models, right? We always start, again, we're going to start at the ovary and work our way around. Number 1, that's a white ball, but you can see about half of it. That's the ovary. Those little extensions here, at arrow number 2 are the fimbriae that becomes or transports an oocyte into the fallopian tubes, which is arrow number 3, to the uterus, number 4. And the same structures, just in another type of a model that we have in that. Ovary, fimbriae, fallopian tubes, and then the uterus. So you can study that on your own. Remember, structure, function, structure, function, structure, function. All right, then we continue. We have the uterus, and we have layers of the uterus, the outer layer, which is what 4 is actually pointing to. The inner layer, which is arrow number 2, and I guess, let me just complete that. 3 is pointing to the middle layer, and 1 is pointing to the cervix. Right? So 1 is pointing to the cervix, 2 the endometrium, 3 the myometrium, 4 the perimetrium. But let me kind of use the black numbers on the models as well, right? So you can kind of see what we're referring to. So the entrance exit point, of the uterus is at arrow number 1. You see where the 2 black 6s are? They're the 2 sides of the opening. I mean, it's not only the passageway there, but it's the tissue here at 6. And then we have the whole uterus. So the most inner layer, the endometrium, is where the little black number 5 is. So the surface, the inner surface of the uterus, and then the myometrium to the middle layer, the contractile layer, and the outer layer, I think that's an 8 there, just above the 4. That's the cookie sheet model. Then we have the larger, kind of a relief model, I guess you could call it, identifying the same structures. Again, structure function, structure function. And I might also want to identify what hormone might target the myometrium: oxytocin, endometrium, estrogen and progesterone. All right, then we look to the outer or more superficial anatomy to a certain extent. One is the vagina, so we're not superficial yet, we're not outside of the body yet. But then we have arrows 2 and 3 pointing to the labia minor or minora and the labia majora at 3. So 2 is pointing to the black number 11 there, and 3, the black 12 there. And then I'll just tell you 13 above that, the blue erectile tissue, that would be the clitoris. And just superior to that at about 10, 11 o'clock, all that fatty tissue, that's the mons pubis. And let us not forget also the pubic symphysis here at blue, pointing to the same structures as we did before. The mons pubis is anterior to the pubic symphysis. All right. So to complete the anatomy, 1 is the clitoris, 2 is the mons pubis, the fatty region there, and 3 is the pubic symphysis. And the reason why we want you to be now again aware of the pubic symphysis is when we look at the hormones of pregnancy, in the next lab, I shouldn't say next week, but the next lab, oxytocin targets the pubic symphysis and the cervix. All right, so it lets the cervix, or I should back up. Oxytocin targets the myometrium, I beg your pardon, and the mammary ducts, and relaxin targets the pubic symphysis here at 3 and the cervix. Sorry, I misspoke. I got ahead of myself there. Okay, all right, so structure, function, structure, function. What if I pointed to number 3 and I said, and this will be more clear again after the next lab, but while we're here looking at this, what hormone of pregnancy or what hormone targets 3? That would be relaxin. All right, then here we have a model of breast tissue. A is pointing to the mammary glands. B is pointing to the mammary ducts. It's a little hard to distinguish them. And even we have another model that isn't really that much better. But when you see this in person, it's about 4 inches or 5 inches by 5 inches square. The purple grape-like looking structures is what A is pointing to. Those are the mammary glands. And these black tubes that B is pointing to here, those are the ducts. So I would keep in mind, because this will become especially highlighted again in these hormones of pregnancy, is that what the mammary glands, and he didn't completely spell that, that should have a Y, glands, that they are associated with milk production, and the hormone that targets them is prolactin. So you might want to just write that into the side now. And then the mammary ducts are the black lines. They transport and milk from the mammary gland to the surface of the body. Milk ejection and milk letdown. And that the mammary ducts are targeted by oxytocin, so OT. Okay, this is the histology. We are in the testes. This whole organ is the testes. This structure here, you can see them kind of coming together. We have 2 tubes, one to about 6, 8 o'clock, and then one to the upper right hand corner. Those are the seminiferous tubules. But you see at the tip of this pointer, this cluster of cells, kind of a triangular shape of cells here. Those are the interstitial cells. They are targeted by luteinizing hormone, and in response, they produce testosterone. Okay, identify the hormone that targets the hormone produced, action of the hormone. So the hormone targets it, is luteinizing hormone. Hormone produces testosterone, stimulates sperm maturation next to it. But it also, testosterone targets general body cells, of fat, muscle. It's associated with developing secondary sexual characteristics in boys during adolescence, and stimulates muscle growth and bone growth. Here now we're pointing to one of the tubules. You don't see it completely on end, but you get the concept. This is going to be a tube. The cells to the periphery like that are going to be your spermatogonia and maybe what's called some nurse cells there. But those spermatogonia, as they enter into meiosis 1 and complete meiosis 1 and then enter meiosis 2 and complete meiosis 2, they move from the periphery like that toward the center of the tube portion, the lumen portion of this tubule. And on some occasions, you can see how their nucleus is starting to change shape and so forth, because they go from one cell and divide into two cells, and then two cells into four cells. And the spermatozoa, you can see the zoas actually in the lumen here that looks like little pieces of fibers or whatnot, in the center here. So as they mature, they migrate toward the center. Sometimes we can see a nice dark oval little nucleus. That's a spermatid. But those in the center, those are spermatozoa. Spermatozoa. Say. Next slide. There we go. Right. Those particular cells out to the periphery of the spermatogonia. And so here we're back looking at that slide. The ones that are migrating toward the center, and I would say at least those with the dark nuclei, those would be spermatocytes. Generally, I would find an area where you could see all three, right? The spermatogonia to the periphery, spermatocytes in the middle, and then maybe right to the surface, like closest to that lumen, we can often find a spermatid. That's not technically a spermatid. I will call that spermatocyte stuff. Oh, and that's all he had. Remember, hopefully there's some other. I believe in my notes there's some better pictures, because the spermatids actually have an oval dark little nucleus. They're just about spermatozoa sperm. They don't have big round nuclei. Right, this is in the ovary. These are oocytes. Generally, when you have one one single layer of cells, that's primary oocyte. And then once you have more than one layer of follicular cells surrounding it, it would be a secondary oocyte. And then it matures and gets larger and larger and larger. I mean, the overall size gets larger. So it says maybe identify the structure, the hormone that targets it, which would be follicle stimulating hormone at the early stages, and LH, a little bit later. What are the hormones produced by their targets? Which she's saying, okay, after ovulation, luteinizing hormone will target that corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone. And the estrogen and progesterone does what? So that goes to that flow chart we looked at the last lesson, where we said anterior pituitary hormone, and hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin, releasing hormone to anterior pituitary in females. Follicle stimulating hormone, targets the oocyte. Luteinizing hormone targets the follicular cells, and then after ovulation, the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum produces the estrogen and progesterone. And estrogen, targets the breast tissue, the fatty tissue there. Estrogen and progesterone targets the endometrium. So that's a valid question too. And I'll try to remember when we quick go through the PowerPoints, is that you could point to the endometrium and say, okay, identify that layer, endometrium. Identify the function of the layer. That's the site of implantation and fetal development. It can also be, it is the layer when there isn't implantation, that exfoliates during menstruation. But you could also say, what hormones target this? Estrogen and progesterone. Right. This is a mature follicle. This is a quite a mature one. You have the secondary follicle in the interior. You have some follicular cells surrounding it. And then you have, it now has just to, the superior aspect of that oocyte. See this, you have this big fluid-filled cavity and those pink, purple staining cells to that's periphery. That whole thing is your secondary oocyte. It's a mature follicle with a secondary oocyte in the center. And that fluid-filled area is called an antrum. And this will get larger and larger. Follicle stimulating hormone targeting the secondary follicle at the tip of the black pointer, and luteinizing hormone targeting those purple pink cells surrounding it entirely, including that big bubble in the center. And when this ruptures, it's going to release that secondary follicle that the pointer is pointing to. And all those other cells and that big fluid-filled cavity remain behind as the corpus luteum. Luteinizing hormone targets that so that those cells continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone in the event of implantation, fertilization, implantation, pregnancy. Identify the structure, the targets. Again, use what we identified in those lessons to fill in the blanks. Sometimes referred to as a Graafian follicle or mature follicle, has a secondary oocyte in the interior. It is waiting to be fertilized so it can complete meiosis too. All right, this whole big structure here, and I'm not sure if I include, well, I know face-to-face I do, and I believe there might be a slide of this. Right after ovulation, I said that the remaining cells in that fluid-filled cavity remain behind, targeted by luteinizing hormone because they will secrete estrogen and progesterone, those cells. This whole big, we call it the big pink blob, right? That whole big structure, that is the corpus luteum. Right? Targeted by luteinizing hormone, early, in your cycle, produces estrogen and progesterone. Later, the next lab, when we look at development, the human chorionic kinetotropin that's being produced by the embryo, as it's implanted, into the endometrium from the placental side of the embryo, it's going to secrete human chorionic kinetotropin, and that targets this to keep producing estrogen and progesterone. Okay, identify the hormones that target it, what are their functions. It's a corpus luteum, luteinizing hormone, and HCG. What before you have implantation, luteinizing hormone. After implantation, so the female does not menstruate, the embryo itself, that implanted structure will release HCG. So you can read through that estrogen, progesterone, what it does. Again, it goes back to that kind of flow chart at this point. The last lesson in the lab guide that we just looked at for number 10. Here it says process A to B. Where does this occur? How many chromosomes, A and B? Right, that has to do with one of those big spermatogenesis, oogenesis cookie sheet models. That's what this is. All right, so if we flip it around, we have meiosis up here at the top. Right? Boys to the left-hand side, girls to the right-hand side. So we have spermatogenesis on the left, right? All right, and we have it labeled up as to primary. It's kind of hard to look at it in this direction, isn't it? But you have a primary spermatocyte, secondary spermatocyte, where we're beginning meiosis 1, ending with meiosis 1, beginning meiosis 2, ending meiosis 2. So at the end of this process, you start with one spermatogonia, which is your stem cell source, and you end with two, primaries. You end with, well, the primary spermatocyte enters into meiosis 1, and at the end of meiosis 1, you end up with two cells, which are now secondary spermatocytes, and then they divide and produce your spermatogonia that further mature into the sperm down at the bottom. So in males, you start with one stem cell, you end up with 4 viable sperm. In females, no. It's a rather complicated process. We just want you to know the basics. All right, so just looking at that one side from A to B is spermatogenesis. It occurs in the seminiferous tubules of the testes. We begin with 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs of chromosomes, and we end with 23 individual chromosomes. Then we look at the female side. We're going to go through the same process, and I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions about at what phase is meiosis 1 interrupted, and then when do we resume it, and then but you should just keep in mind how similar it is in that, we have meiosis 1, that we begin with a primary oocyte, and we end with a secondary oocyte. Then we end it into meiosis 2. And at the end of that process, we're going to end with a viable cell. But the difference between males and females of the many is that at the end of meiosis 1, we have one secondary oocyte and one polar body. So what happens is that instead of having, like males do, equal cytokinesis, equal division of all the organelles in the cytoplasm, so that you produce two mirror image, essentially, cells, so to speak. Not technically mirror image, but the same size, the same organelles. In females, one oocyte will dominate and take the majority of organelles in the cytoplasm, and then produce what's called one little polar body, which has very little cytoplasm organelles that would allow survival. However, they both enter into meiosis 2, and even the polar body will split at the end of meiosis 2. You can see them, the two little yellow balls down here. I believe that's number 21, maybe, on the cookie sheet model. And then upon fertilization, the other oocyte will complete meiosis 2 and produce another polar body. Then that kind of shows you what's going on. And then at that point, we are fertilized, and we enter into, down at the bottom, we now have a zygote, and we enter into the cleavage process. And so that process of oogenesis occurs in the ovaries, start with 46 chromosomes, end with 23. Okay, and that is the end of those images. I'm going to quick stop my share and then go back in and let me get the notes, because it gives you some additional information should you require it, but it also has some other models, and I find that those are actually quite helpful. So let me see if there's anything of particular importance or that is most helpful. Okay, so we look at anatomy of the males. You can read through that. Again, labeling up slightly different types of labels. The other ones had the arrows, but pointing to same structures. These make good study tool. That model we used, remember, in AMP1, or one of them anyway, for identifying the testes and the bladder, as reproductive system outside the body cavity. D was the urinary bladder, part of the urinary system inside the abdominal pelvic cavity. This is another model that shows you, which we looked at to a certain extent in the urinary system, right? But you have here ureters, seminal vesicles, and a prostate gland. And in the white, those are the vas deferens. All right, this I think is a very good histological picture to study from. Maybe the other one is good, but you really can't distinguish anything. So I think what I've done is I've used this picture for testing purposes, but you can now see the difference between them. And it's all labeled over to the left-hand side. So I think that's easier. A are your interstitial cells. Luteinizing hormone targets it, it produces testosterone. Boom. Right now, to a certain extent, that testosterone targets the neighboring cells in this seminiferous tubules adjacent to it, but it also targets, secondary other body cells, general body cells, helps stimulates the development of secondary sexual characteristics in males, so forth and so on. Right. B, so to the outer periphery, I want that there's one seminiferous tubule there. Right, you can't see the whole thing, but you get the concept that it's a tube. The cells to the periphery are the spermatogonia, 46 chromosomes, targeted by FSH and testosterone. This is spermatogenesis. C, and we could have easily pointed to something between B and D there. Those would be with the slightly smaller dark staining nuclei. Those are your spermatocytes. And then D, you see what I mean about these dark staining little, they're like dark almonds. Those are spermatids. And then in the lumen here are some spermatozoa. So I said below that spermatozoa are spermatids with tails, and they have 23 chromosomes. But this is a good picture where you can see, all of them. Again, now blown up more, even better still. Look at that. We've got the spermatids, A is pointing to, right? B are the spermatocytes, and C are the spermatogonia. Very pretty. This talks about the physiology of male structure, function. You go through that. Blah, blah, blah. Again, this is shows you the pathway. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone, FSH in males. What's the production site, the target, the action? All this information can be just used to answer even questions, and statements that say you should be able to identify these cells, know what hormone targets them, what is their action. Here is all that material. Oopsie doodle. Scroll the wrong one. Right, then we get into female anatomy. Again, mammary ducts, mammary glands, the clitoris, the perimetrium, the myometrium, the endometrium, cervix, mons pubis, vagina, fimbriae. Oocytes produce oocytes, estrogen, progesterone. The ovary. Right, fallopian tubes, labia major or minor, or majora and minora, however you want to say that. Mammary glands, the uterus, and now the same models, but slightly labeled a little bit different, but very, very similar. Here's another one. We're going to look at this more next week. This shows you the ovary and the different phases of oogenesis. It says here, and things that are, you can't quite see the numbers on this, but the myometrium is the red middle layer of the uterus. Oxytocin targets it and causes it to contract. And then the endometrium is that kind of like beige inner layer. You see that little knob there? That represents something, well, not something, but an embryo trying to implant. So that layer is the endometrium. It is a target of estrogen in the first 14 days of your menstrual cycle, and specifically targeted by the progesterone in the second 14 days. Thus, we have these what's called follicular phases and different phases and luteinizing phases, of the uterus, that ties together with the estrogen and progesterone that's being produced of ovaries. Here we have the breast model, the glands versus the ducts. Right, the ducts are targeted by oxytocin. The mammary glands are targeted by prolactin. Again, we'll cover that more later in the next lab. Here we have a very good picture of the histology of the uterus, of the ovary, I beg your pardon. And D and B, so we have an oocyte in the center and one rather thick layer of cells surrounding it. That is a primary follicle. And B, or A and C, I should say, together is a secondary or mature follicle, sometimes referred to as a Graafian follicle. So the oocyte C is now a secondary oocyte. A, is pointing to these follicular granulosa cells. D is the primary follicle with follicular or granulosa cells B surrounding it. So we go from that BD structure. As it grows, it becomes that AC structure. Follicle stimulating hormone is targeting C and D, and B and A is being targeted by luteinizing hormone. Okay, then here are some additional pictures. I was just kind of reading some of that children on it. Just other views. This again, down to the bottom right-hand side, we just call the big pink blob because you really can't tell much more than that from it. When you see this big mass of white, pink tissue that looks homogeneous, that is the corpus luteum, called the big pink blob. Produces estrogen and progesterone. It's targeted by luteinizing hormone and human chorionic kinetotropin. And so here we have, again, similarly to that last exercise that we did in the lab guide, what are the hormones and what do they target? And I believe that's it. All right, very good. We are done. Thank you.